And I am live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Blood Up Dietitians page for my Facebook Live. I'm logging on a few minutes early so that I can make sure this is all set up right and looks good, and then we'll get started. If anybody has any questions, please be sure to post them in the comments because I want to make sure I address everybody's concerns and questions when we're going through today. So. A few people popping on. Hi, everyone. Heather Mangieri here. Excited that you could join us or join me in the Build Up Dietitians page for this Facebook Live today. I'm excited to talk to you all. I promoted this on some of my social channels, got a few questions, nothing real specific, just kind of some people interested in how I got started in this particular field of young athletes. So I'm going to address that today and a few other things as well. So. Couple more minutes. Okay, well, it's noon, and that is the official start time of this Facebook Live on the Build Up Dietitians page. So thank you to those of you joining, and I know this is a kind of a middle of the day time. At least for those of us on the East Coast, it's lunchtime, but it's falls across the nation at different times. So I'm going to talk and address things. If you have questions, then please type them in the comments. Let me know you're here. I'd love to know who's on, so just say hi. I'll probably have to put my glasses back on because I don't like talking with them if I don't have to, but unfortunately, I have older eyes and I can't see as well without my readers. So I'm excited to be here. What I want to share today is my journey as a dietitian, and then also kind of moving into my journey through becoming a sports dietitian, and then focusing specifically on fueling young athletes. So that's kind of what we're going to chat about today. And then I also want to dive into some of the kind of take-home messages on what you need to have, and kind of some expertise and some areas in actually like fueling young athletes and what that means. So before I start, I want to share with you where you can find more information about me and fueling young athletes. My website is Heather Mangieri Nutrition. It's pretty simple. I have a blog. I share recipes, mostly for just really easy recipes. I am by no means a chef, and I don't have chef training, but I do work with very busy families and sports families. So most of my recipes are just quick, easy things to get healthy food on the table. And then I also have a lot of article pages where I address concerns that I've seen and had, and then food industry issues as well. So you can find that on my website at Heather Mangieri Nutrition. I'm also on social media. Would love to connect with everyone there. My handle is my name, Heather Mangieri, on Instagram, on Pinterest, Twitter, and even on Facebook. It's Heather Mangieri Nutrition. So would love to connect with you all. Please, reach out. Let me know if you have questions. I've been a lifelong volunteer in the field of nutrition and dietetics, literally since I was in my undergrad at Penn State. I was the president of the Student Dietetic Association there, and have literally been a volunteer and been working with the Academy and different Pittsburgh Local Dietetic Association, Pennsylvania Dietetic Association ever since, and even SCAN I do a lot with. So would love to connect with you guys there. So when I promoted this, one of the questions I got was, how did you get into the field of sports nutrition and specifically fueling young athletes? So I'm just going to share my journey. When I talk to students, I share it a lot. I basically went to school as an undergrad at Penn State. I didn't start in nutrition. I started in business, went into criminal psychology, had some different majors, and really decided that I wanted to help people, but I didn't want to do anything that had to do with blood. So I didn't want to be nursing, and nutrition was a great field because I've always felt that food and what we eat really impacted our body. So went to Penn State, got my nutrition degree. And hi, Kim, thanks for joining. I don't know if a lot of times the programs today are a little different, but at Penn State, it was not a matching program. So I had to actually go through the matching system, and I did not get matched with an internship. So at that time, it was a big deal. If you got matched, you went to an internship, you were able to sit for your RD exam. I did not get matched. So I was like, oh no, now what? Time to get a job. So at that time, I decided I wanted to live in South Carolina, and I applied to every hospital system and just searched for a job in South Carolina so that I could move there and work there, and did not get a job in South Carolina. I actually ended up in New Jersey. So it was a great, not exactly what I had in mind, but looking back on my journey, I am so thankful of the way it turned out. I took a job at Gold's Gym, and I also became a fitness instructor, and I taught classes, and I worked and ran a 6-week weight management program there. And I also worked with fitness enthusiasts. So some athletes that came through there that trained, the owner of the gym at the time was a trainer, and he worked a lot with athletes, younger athletes, and collegiate type athletes. So I was exposed to that from that time. I worked there for about a year, and then I never lost sight of the fact that I really wanted to get my RD and make sure that I was credentialed in this field. So I reapplied the next year, and actually, I don't think it was the next year, it was 2 years later. I reapplied, and I got matched with an internship in Pittsburgh. It was the Family Health Council at the time. So went through my internship. It was great. I also, in preparation for making sure that I got matched, while I was working at Gold's Gym, I was working part-time at the local hospital as a diet tech. And I think that's really, really important because I wanted to make sure that when I went on that interview for that internship and that I spoke about my experience, that I was going to be selected, that I had the experience, I put the time in, and I was really fortunate that I did get a match the second time. So as I went through, or after I got my internship and became a dietitian, my first job was in long-term care. I loved it. And the long-term care facility that I worked at actually closed, which is probably the only reason at the time that I had left. And then the next job that I took was as a clinical dietitian, which again, I loved. And decided that I wanted to go back to grad school to get more training in sports and wellness and human performance. So at the time, the University of Pittsburgh had a program. It was a new program for a master's in called human or wellness and human performance. So I went through that program. And at the same time had my kids and got pregnant and had kids. And then after I graduated, I began to teach part-time or adjunct at the University of Pittsburgh. And I also taught some sports nutrition classes at Chatham. So it was at that time that I decided to start my private practice, and that was really kind of the beginning of the career path that I am still on, and I still have my practice, although it's not as full-time as it was back then. So after I had my master's degree, and I really felt competent in physiology and exercise physiology and then understanding nutrient metabolism and the way the body worked, felt very confident in working with athletes. And that is when I started my practice. Hi, Leah. So one of the questions that I get often is, how did I go from becoming a sports dietitian to working with young athletes? And it was kind of funny at the time because I was getting a lot of athletes that were 17 years old. And I just remember looking at food logs and thinking like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how many people ate, if I can say the brand name on here, but Pop-Tarts. It was just crazy to me, like breakfast strudels were such a popular item. And I was like, all of these 17-year-olds are eating them. But at the time I was like, wow, this is really interesting that I'm getting so many athletes that are 16, 17. And the reason why is they were all looking for college scholarships. So they were athletes throughout their high school career, and then they really were looking for that next step in terms of getting a scholarship to college to play sports. And that was when I really started to say, hey, this is really kind of fun. I don't know if you've worked with some of you that might work with younger athletes, or I don't consider myself necessarily a pediatric expert, but learning about those ages of fueling through growth and development, I did not feel I had enough training in that area. So I spent a lot of time reading and taking continuing education courses specifically in adolescent development and understanding growth and development and puberty and how the body changes. And that was specifically because I knew that I needed to understand that in order to really help calculate nutrition needs and make sure that I was helping people the right way. So that was how I kind of ended up here. The more I worked with athletes, the more younger athletes, the more questions I got. So I would have coaches calling me and parents calling me, and it was a lot of the same questions over and over again. We have a weekend match. What should we eat the night before? What should we eat the day of? What should I bring in the cooler for the bus for the athletes? And I started looking for resources because I just didn't have all these handouts developed for this population. And I couldn't find any really, really good, reliable, evidence-based resources for this that I could recommend. And I did read a lot of the sports nutrition books for young athletes that were out there, and I was a little bit nervous about some of the things that I was reading. Just not evidence-based, people that wrote them and clearly didn't understand growth and development, which was a huge piece of needing to understand whenever you work with younger athletes. So that was when I decided I was going to create my own resource, and I needed to author this book, and I started to write Fueling Young Athletes. And it was a long process. I actually wrote my introduction and my outline, and I remember, gosh, I had this probably for a year. And then I lost it somehow. I remember not being able to find it anywhere. And so I just couldn't believe it. And I was searching and searching, and I sat on it. And then I waited probably another solid year before I dove back in, because I was just kind of devastated that I had put all this time and effort into organizing the way I wanted the book to be, and it was gone. So, and then I think it was a SCAN or FENSI event, and Human Kinetics was there, and somebody had recommended me as an author, a co-author for a book, and that project ended up falling through. But at the time, the publisher said, if you have any ideas of sports nutrition books that you think are needed, bring them to us. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. There needs to be a really, really solid resource on fueling young athletes that's up to date, that's relevant, and that really addresses all of the concerns, kind of a comprehensive book that when I get these questions from parents and coaches, I could say, yes, turn to page 67 of my book and you're going to find the answer there. So that was kind of how I got started. And long process, tons of research read. But if you work in this field at all, you know that there's not a lot of research evidence on specifically fueling young athletes, and that's mostly because it's not really ethical to study, does this work in a child, and if it does, it, great, and if it doesn't, oh well. So a lot of the sports nutrition recommendations that we have for younger athletes are based on kind of extrapolating information from adult athletes and kind of like tweaking it and kind of using some common sense and using experience, using common sense and knowing what we know, and then kind of going from there. So let me put my glasses on because I think somebody chimed in. Oh, great. Excited that you're excited for this. Thanks for joining us. So that kind of brings me to working with young athletes. And there's so much. I could talk about this topic all day long. So I really wanted to kind of address some main points of what I think is important and what separates sports dietitians, trained sports dietitians, from other coaches or trainers or other professionals or non-professionals that work with young athletes. And in my opinion, the main difference is, as a dietitian, the first priority for me and for most dietitians is health. And it's not something that everybody thinks about as a first priority. Now, we know athletes want to win. That's their goal. They care about sports nutrition because they're looking for some sort of a competitive advantage, and they want to be better at their sport. They want to win. They want to perform better. And I totally get that. And we have to understand that in this field. But not at the expense of health. And I think that's the big thing that separates being a trained sports dietitian from somebody else in the field. I'm always thinking about the health of the athlete first. And so even though I don't talk to young athletes about health because they don't really care about health, quite frankly, their parents care about health and other experts care about health, but athletes don't really think about it. They just think about winning and being better and performing well. So understood. And that's why talking to a younger athlete, it's really, really important to make sure that we are talking their language and making sure that we're talking in a way that they trust, that we understand that they are here and they're trying to learn this because they want to win at their sport. So that's key. It's always interesting when I start working with young athletes because most of the time they come into the office when I have one-on-one clients, and they definitely have heard nutrition information, and a lot of times they already assume that they know more than I do about sports nutrition, and I have to work really hard to gain their trust. I mean, that's like number one. So that has to be the priority. And in order to gain the trust of a young athlete who, again, has heard information, has read information, and really, if they read it on the internet or if their coach or trainer has told it to them, they do believe it to be true most of the time. So it's really important to focus on making sure you talk to them so that they know that you know what you're talking about and that you really are a good source of information. So that leads me to like the first thing. One, health is always in the back of the mind. But the second one is something that a lot of sports dietitians don't think about when they start working in this field, and that is understanding sports culture. So what's being talked about in the locker room? What does each individual sport look like? And if you don't know how to talk that talk with the young athlete, you don't understand their training schedule, you don't know the sport, it's really difficult to gain that trust because they're already assuming that you don't get it or that you don't understand. So anytime I am talking with dietitians or trainers or anybody that works with young athletes, I always encourage them to make sure that they're very familiar with the sport culture. They understand the culture, they understand what's happening in that sport, and then they understand the position, the specific position of the athlete that they're going to work with. So obviously that's very individualized. Even in something like gymnastics, where you might think, oh yeah, I mean, they're doing all of these different things, but you know, knowing the floor routine, knowing the bars, knowing all of the different components of the sport is really, really a critical piece as well. So one thing that I learned very early on in my career as a sports dietitian with young athletes is that athletes trust their coaches, and that is, it's just a huge thing, and it's great. It's great as long as the coach knows sports nutrition and is giving good advice. And unfortunately, not all high school coaches especially know or understand adolescent development and understand sports nutrition for young athletes. So there's a lot of nutrition information out there for performance, but when you're dealing with young athletes, you have this major layer that has to be understood, and that layer is growth and development, health, and then on top of that, what do they need for performing and putting in all of this extra energy expenditure that they're putting in? How does their body develop? How are all of these basic things and coming first, and then on top of that, like all of this energy expenditure. So even though the most popular question I get across the board is, what should I eat before? What should I eat during? What should I eat after? I really, really want to address all of those questions. And I have, you know, handouts on those and very specific like lists of foods and things that make good snacks. But my job as a sports dietitian is to remind everyone that day-to-day nutrition is what matters the most when it comes to fueling young athletes. And that is because these nutrient deficiencies that cause problems with performance, they don't happen overnight. You know, if you're not eating right before, sure, it could slow performance, but if you have iron deficiency, for example, it's definitely going to impact your performance way more than just not having time to eat that one event. And I see that so often, that this is kind of an overlooked piece. And it's like, well, I don't really think about what I eat for breakfast on a day-to-day basis, but I do always make sure that I have that perfectly balanced meal right before I go on the field, which is great, but it's not necessarily the most important thing. So let me just, great point. Okay, thanks, Kim. So glad you joined us. I'm going to scroll up here so I can see these comments. Athletics, yes. Okay. So by the way, if you guys have questions, please put them in the comments. If you're watching this after the fact, if you're not on live, I still, I'll check back, and if you have specific questions on anything that I didn't address that you had an interest in, I would, be more than happy to comment and, try to get your questions answered. Let's see. So that's understanding the sports culture and understanding the importance of reaching the coaches and the whole team. So that was one of the things that was really important to me when I wrote my book, because I thought, well, I'm only one person, and there are definitely great dietitians working with sports nutrition today. Years ago when I started in the field, it wasn't like it is today. Well, there weren't as many. There were a lot, but not as many. My mentors that I learned from that maybe aren't even working in the field anymore, but today there's a lot of dietitians that are even doing coaching and very specific training on helping dietitians do this. One of the resources that I have with Fueling Young Athletes is a continuing education course that can offer like continuing ed credits for dietitians that are interested in working with the field and working with young athletes. Another really key piece is for this book, for me, was targeting coaches. And I still, to this day, work really hard at educating coaches and athletic trainers, because they are the ones that are working with those student athletes day in and day out. And they're only seeing me if they come to me. And usually that's because of some sort of an issue that we're having to correct because of poor fueling, because something was going on, whether it's performance or injury or a lot of times body composition issues that went too high or too low, or they're trying to change that in a healthy way. So reaching coaches is critical, and building relationships with coaches and athletic trainers is like the key to reaching athletes, because they trust those coaches and they're the ones that are like right there. Unfortunately, in high school, the coaches are all over the place in terms of training. So a lot of the schools, some schools might have like the math teacher is the coach of the, football coach or the track coach. So maybe not a lot of training in adolescent development or even nutrition, but loves the sport and, has taken on this role. Other schools have more advanced trainers, and some schools have athletic trainers right on staff, but not all high schools have that at this point either. So it's getting better, way better than it was when I started in this field. So it's come a long way. The other important thing I want to drive home here is the difference when you're working with young athletes between chronological age and developmental age. And so it's really, to me, this is something that I talk a lot about when I talk to dietitians and trainers and coaches. If you have two 14-year-old athletes, they could be at very different stages of development. And so the way you talk to them, the way that the concerns that they have, the way that you counsel them, and then their needs are very different. So it's not as easy as saying I have a 14-year-old swimmer. It's really about evaluating that athlete and saying, I have a 14-year-old swimmer who's at this stage of development, and then kind of going from there in terms of how you're going to proceed with recommendations and calculating needs and helping them to feel properly for their sport. So very, very, very critical piece of advice. If you don't understand, if you are interested in going into sports nutrition and focusing on young athletes, I really, really advise getting some additional training in adolescent development and really understanding what that means. I always give the example, I do a lot of consulting work now, and so I'll have companies that will say, like, will you write, we want you to write a series of handouts on young athletes. And I'll say, okay, well, young athletes is a 6-year-old athlete that's playing, soccer at the YMCA, and it's a 18-year-old football player who's a senior, and we can't really categorize them together. They're both considered young athletes, but they're not necessarily at the same level by any means. So what that looks like whenever you're writing, whether it's handouts or like you're helping organizations or helping coaches understand, is I like to think about it in terms of like pre-puberty, and then active puberty, and then post-puberty, and then kind of adjusting recommendations based on that. Pre-puberty, we know that kids have, it's pretty straightforward when calculating out nutrition needs and kind of coming up with fueling plans. Puberty, it's like all over the place, out the door. It could change from day to day. And then post-puberty, it goes back to getting a little bit more straightforward, but needs are going to be a little bit easier to calculate based on, if they're post-puberty, based on that age and developmental status. So really, really thinking about it in terms of that, like what age group within fueling young athletes are we talking about? So I do a lot of education with that in terms of like helping people to understand that. So what else did I want to talk to you about? One of the big, again, drive home points, what separates a trained sports dietitian from somebody else that works with young athletes. We see tons of information with athletes on performance nutrition. And that's, again, like I said at the beginning, very, very important to athletes. They want to win, they're there for performance, they want to do better. But what separates a trained sports dietitian from somebody that just can give those performance tips is really understanding that big picture. And as a dietitian that works one-on-one, most of the time athletes don't come to me for performance. They are coming to me because of a problem. So maybe they're getting repeatedly injured and they can't understand why, or parents are like needing help to figure out if they're fueling right because of injuries, or they keep getting fractures. a lot of times for me personally, I get athletes that have their performance has declined for kind of an unknown reason. So they might, last year they were state champ and this year their running time has slowed down. Like, what has happened? If you just look online, you're going to read a lot about carbohydrates and fueling and not getting enough food, when a lot of times those are micronutrient issues that I'm finding, things like iron deficiency or not getting enough vitamin D, and some of those deeper issues that are really obvious to somebody that's trained in sports nutrition, but maybe not so obvious that somebody that's just focused on performance nutrition. So it's a really, really important piece to remember that we have these clinical skills as sports dietitians that come into practice so often, even with changing body composition, right? I mean, I get obviously certain sports, there is some body composition issues. A runner is going to be a better runner if they are, at a certain body weight and body composition, but not an unhealthy one. So it's really important to know the difference. So I hope that was kind of an overview of, working with young athletes. There's references, resources. People ask me all the time, what are your best resources? My best resources are dietitians. I mean, I can't tell you, throughout my entire career, I have a solid network of dietitians that are colleagues, but also very good friends of mine, and I rely on them a lot. That's why this, Build Up Dietitians, this whole organization and page is so fantastic, because it allows us to network and know each other and like reach out to each other. I know I did not ever think that I would be a dietitian talking about with a disordered eating or eating disorders. I was not trained in it. It was not my chosen area of expertise. But I started when I was working with athletes getting a lot that had disordered eating issues. And I was referring a lot of my athletes to a colleague of mine that was in Pittsburgh that specialized in eating disorders. And after a couple of years, I was like, I'm referring all of my clients away because a lot of them have disordered eating, and it's not eating disorder necessarily, but like just disordered eating or food fears. And I was like, I got to get better trained at this. So I, again, just like developmental, spent a lot of my time getting continuing ed, learning. I had a colleague, Marjorie, that was in the Academy spokesperson program with me. She's an expert in eating disorders. I would call her constantly and say, help me, and so you get to the point after a while where you have enough training that you're like, yeah, I really do feel very, very competent and capable of helping an athlete that has pretty much any issue or any problem. And I can, I've had enough experience to do this, but in the meantime, you can reach out to colleagues and reach out to other dietitians that have more experience and say, look, I really, would need the help. And like I said earlier, a lot of dietitians nowadays they have their own coaching programs, which I think is awesome because, again, back when I started in the field, that didn't exist as much. I know Jessica Setnick had, she's an eating disorders dietitian, and she had a training that I went through, and a lot of them, that was one specialty, but now there's a lot more. So a lot more available to us, and it's a great field to be in, and especially working with young athletes. If you love a great challenge, and this is the field to be in, because challenge it is, not only with working with figuring out what they need because their bodies are changing and they're growing and they're developing and they're at all different stages, but also personalities, and they're dealing with so much social anxiety a lot of times, and stresses and homework and part-time jobs and training and people wanting them to be successful in school and in their sport. And it's sometimes just so overwhelming for a young athlete, and sticking yourself in their shoes, making sure that as soon as you start working with them, they know that they trust that you get it. That's key to success. So happy to be here today, everyone. I hope you all kind of enjoyed this and learned. And like I said, I'll be checking back to see if there's any additional questions. Let me check here before I leave. I'm not seeing some comments, but let's see, Leanne. High school leaders, I was doing so a lot of things that lead me to private practice. Awesome. Hello, Heather. What if the coach doesn't offer good advice or harmful advice nutritionally to their athletes? How do you go about with initiating? Oh, this is such a great question, Dustin. I'm going a little over my time, but I'm going to address this because it's important. I've had this a lot. So two things. One is if you have an athlete or a parent or parents that that feel comfortable addressing it, I like to share information with the actual athlete and the family, not saying, oh, your coach is wrong. No, it's really showing that respect, but explaining to them that, sports nutrition is my area of expertise. Coaching is not my area of expertise, and it could be that the coach, doesn't necessarily have a total area of expertise in sports nutrition. Here's what I would recommend. If you feel comfortable going to that coach and saying, we met with a sports dietitian, she's really adamant about this, we'd like to incorporate it, or, how do you feel about it, or just kind of talking about it. That's one way. I have reached out to coaches myself on behalf of my clients a lot of times, and they're usually pretty receptive. I can't ever actually remember somebody saying, oh, no, you're not gonna tell me how to teach my athletes about nutrition. A lot of times they don't know what they don't know. So it's not necessarily that they're intentionally giving bad advice. A lot of times they have read something, or it's what works for them as an athlete, or it works for their friend, or so it's not always intentional. And sometimes it just really is like they just, they don't know, and they really don't know that they're giving any advice that would necessarily be, quote, harmful. It's just that they're not really in the know. So I can remember some specific cases where I've had coaches and situations for my athletes that I felt were dangerous situations. Most of the time it revolves around hydration practices and coaches saying or not allowing fluids, or withholding fluids. And I am, very, very blunt about that being very, you're dealing with a child, and that to me is very abusive and very dangerous. And I, talking to the family and saying, look, this is very dangerous. Going to the coach and saying, look, I want my child to be making sure that they're fueling at these intervals. Do you really have an issue with this? And if the family's not comfortable with it, then, I've called the coaches myself and said, I have a client that's, having some issues. I'm worried about hydration issues. Do you have some sort of protocol in place that you use? And normally they're just oblivious. They don't know. And then afterwards they say, okay, and then it kind of improves from there. Maybe not ideal situation all the time, but it does improve. So hopefully that was helpful. Pushing excessive protein, scared of carbs. Absolutely. I mean, this is kind of a growing concern. Again, what we can do is just educate. So, it depends on the developmental age of the young athlete in terms of how deep you go into education. I'm really big in counseling on encouraging athletes to find the answer themselves. So I educate, share information, and then say, okay, so what do you need to do now? And a lot of times they'll say, well, it sounds like I just need to add some more carbs in. And I'll say, yeah, I agree. And so then I'm like, well, what carbs could you add? And sometimes, again, everybody's very individualized. So do they have carbs that they feel are bad carbs? Or, we know that they need carbohydrates. We know that they need, the more active they are, the more they need. And it's really just a matter of helping them to see it so that they're the ones figuring it out. I'm just really, really big on that, especially with the younger athletes, because they've been told what to do a lot. And it's really important, I feel, as the counselor, to encourage them and kind of give them the skills that they need to make the decisions themselves and empower them and make them feel like they're figuring it out for themselves. So hopefully that helped you. We need more IDs in this field. Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yes, please. Everybody needs more education. I spoke on Fancy about this. There is a lot going on in the field of fueling or training young athletes that's changing. I spoke about the USA Hockey has a great program that's going on where there's really going to be in the future, I don't know, hopefully I get them around to see it, but really kind of putting standards in place where coaches have to have a certain level of training in order to work with and train young athletes, and also looking at developmental age instead of like, okay, you're 10, you're going with this group, you're 12, you're going with this group. It's really going to be at some point in the future. It's being worked on. It's not going to be anytime soon, I don't think, across the board. But I think one day we will look at it more in terms of developmental age and having a sports dietitian involved in these programs and having that more of a team approach, and hopefully having demanding education for the coaches. Yes, even non-athletes are scared of carbs. Are you seeing a rise in eating disorders in athletes at younger? It's a great question. I work with athletes that have disordered eating, and a lot of times they come to me for that. They know that they're scared of food. Usually, if I used to have a practice full time, so I saw this a lot more where I would discover it. It's a sticky situation because, you know, a lot of times people, especially with athletes, they have very specific eating patterns and they don't see themselves as having disordered eating. And I mean, I've worked with even males, you know, I'm seeing a rise in male athletes with disordered eating issues as well. So we have to really kind of make sure that that's in the back of our mind and evaluate it, but not assume that somebody, because they're so regimented, that they have an eating disorder. It's more about helping them to identify that the pattern of eating that they have is not supporting their health and their growth and development and their performance, and then helping them to see why it's not, and then helping them to come up with a plan so that, you know, it's working better for them. And again, when they figure it out, I just find that they are so much more receptive to kind of doing it. You know, it's not me telling them that they need to do this. It's more like, this dietitian helped me to understand why I'm having this issue, and yeah, it makes sense, I need to do this. And then they have a little bit more freedom. Remember, kids love control, right? This is an age group that they're fighting for control. So we want to make sure that we're giving them some of that, and we're empowering them to make decisions, and we're not just telling them what to do. Yes, thank you. Oh, great. Thank you, guys. Again, if anybody's tuning in later, I'm over my time, but I hope this was helpful, and it was great to chat with you all today. And if anybody has any comments or questions afterwards, I'll be checking back to see it. So thanks a lot. And please, we need more dietitians fueling young athletes. So get out there and encourage that. Have a great day.